Good evening, universe. Tonight I'm going to be talking about kind of a different topic. It does relate to reading, as I'm sure you can tell from the title, but it's also going to be in celebration of Mental Health Awareness Month. Simply put, today I'm going to be talking about the reasons why I read so slow, and a lot of that has to do with my mental health. So I'm going to start with the ones that are fairly recognizable so that you guys know what I'm talking about, and then I'm going to move into the more complicated but also more directly related to why I read a little bit more slowly than other booktubers. It's a little bit of a challenge for me to talk about, but I am hoping that somebody resonates with some of the stuff I say, and besides, the more people that talk about it, the less of a stigma there is, so maybe in the future somebody else will have an easier time as well. So, the simple ones. I have anxiety and depression. Like I said, these are the easiest ones for me to explain, in that when I say those words, you probably have a general idea, at least, of what I'm talking about. Even though there are still a lot of misconceptions in the public about what depression and anxiety are and how they work, you have some sense of what I'm talking about. Now, those particular things are not actually directly related to my reading most of the time, so that's pretty much all I have to say about them for now. The next one you have probably heard of, but you may be a little bit less familiar with. And while this one doesn't fall under a distinct disorder diagnosis, it is something that affects me, and it's something that occasionally affects my reading. So it is very easy for me to disassociate, also known as experience depersonalization or derealization. There are a lot of nuances and things about this that could be said, as with all mental health things, but I'm not really an expert on them because, I'm not a psychiatrist or anything like that. So I'm just going to talk about what it feels like for me when I experience this. Basically, it is easy for me to feel unconnected from my body, or as if the reality happening around me is not real somehow. For example, when I was a kid, when I first started experiencing this, I used to tell my parents that I felt like I was dreaming all of the time. So there's like two categories in which this will start to bother me. One, in which I become too enraptured in something and get bingey. If I start to binge books, especially if they're all set in the same world type thing, like they're all a series, if I stick in that for too long, it's very easy for me to feel a little bit unconnected from reality. So that's something that I have to look out for when I am choosing the order in which I read books. Less relatedly, but still important, is that sometimes I'll experience this when I'm under a large amount of stress, or when my depression or anxiety happen to be particularly bad. When I'm having disassociative moments, it can be difficult to decide if the best thing to do is to read or to not read. For example, sometimes I find it very helpful when I'm disassociating to observe with all of my senses everything that's happening around me, and that can kind of ground me in the moment and kind of shake me out of that sense of being like unattached to the world. But also sometimes reading can help lower my stress and anxiety levels, and that will help me feel more real. So that can be something of a tricky balance, and I definitely don't have it all figured out just yet. It's definitely one of those things that I have to take case by case, and sometimes I do get it wrong. So obviously that can detract from my reading time, because if I'm having a disassociative episode, then it's really important that I take the time to do the self-care that I need. Sometimes that will mean not reading, and that will take away from my reading time. This is also why I tend not to binge books. There is an amount of suspension of disbelief that it is important for me to make sure that I don't cross that threshold a little too far and get too enwrapped in something, because it can trigger that feeling of disassociation. It is extremely unpleasant for me, by the way, if you've never experienced it. It feels awful to me because it often makes me feel very helpless and like I don't really know who I am. It's very confusing and overwhelming of a sensation. So obviously I try to avoid it whenever I can. There are some times when disassociation is helpful for your brain when you're going through a particularly traumatic experience or something like that. But obviously, since my brain is doing this frequently under experiences that are not necessarily traumatic, it is something that I try to steer away from because that's not helpful and it is distressing to me. It can can also trigger in relation to the last thing that I'm going to tell you about. This one is the one that's most complicated and the one that I have the least clinical terms to describe. The best diagnosis I've gotten for this is that I might have a strange intersection of obsessive compulsive disorder and sensory processing disorder. This is the main thing that is suspected to be the root cause of this issue that I'm going to tell you about. The main thing I think is going to be difficult is making it clear how this is a problem, because a lot of times when I explain this, people don't understand the level of distress that it does cause me. So basically, I have a very associative kind of brain. The way that you might hear a song that you listened to when you were in a particularly emotional state and be brought back to that emotional state, I am like that with many experiences in my life, often to an extent that doesn't really make logical sense. An example of this, and I think some people will relate to this, is I can be very conscious of the clothes that I'm wearing. If I am wearing a particular outfit and I go to a place that I don't want to go, then sometimes I will associate that outfit with the place that I don't want to go. So for example, if I have to run errands at the DMV and I'm wearing an outfit that I like, then sometimes I'll like that outfit less afterwards because I'll associate it with having been to the DMV. So I make those kinds of connections a lot. And in some ways that can be extremely unhelpful because then it is impeding things that I like. It almost always happens in like the negative way. For example, in that example, if I go to the DMV and I'm wearing an outfit that I like, the DMV isn't better because of the outfit that I wore that I like, but the outfit is worse from having been to the DMV with me. I hope that makes as much sense as something that doesn't make sense can make. That associative quality that I have is really important when it comes to the next facet of this, which is essentially that I am extremely sensitive to quality of light. It has classically been extremely difficult for me to explain the kind of light that I find distressing, but I'm going to give it a shot. So light that feels stark or starkly angled to me is my least favorite kind of light. For example, fluorescent lights. I really don't like those. Or when you're in a particular type of lighting where the shadows become very long and sharp. I don't like that. And honestly, this can be a little bit tricky when I'm filming YouTube videos because I don't have that much ability to get better, more diffuse lighting that still shows up on camera. So I do have to have a little bit of brighter, bolder light, which in most of my day-to-day life, I would avoid as much as possible. But I find it very distressing when the light is wrong. So generally, the more stark, often the more orange or the more severely white. So when it's really, really warm lighting or really, really cold lighting, I don't like either of those. They can be very upsetting to me, by which I mean that they actively make my mood significantly worse when I am exposed to them. So I can be having a good day and not be depressed at all, and then be exposed to one of those qualities of light, and then I am depressed for at least as long as I continue to be exposed to that light, and sometimes longer. Obviously, because the sun exists, this is a problem. There are definitely certain times of day that become much more difficult for me to handle than other types of day. I've done my best to circumvent this as much as possible. I can change the blinds and the interior lighting and stuff like that, and I can mostly avoid going outside when I know the light is going to be harsh, but I don't end up avoiding it completely. That would impede my life even more than it currently does. So for example, sometimes I have to run errands and the light is bad and I have to do that anyway. Where this comes into reading is essentially that when I work on a creative project, such as writing, or engage with something that would inspire me to work on a creative project, such as reading, watching a television show that I'm really invested in, or playing a video game that matters a lot to me and has significant story elements, it is critical to me that I do so in the correct lighting, which tends to be diffuse, slightly warm lighting. Usually I achieve this with a whole lot of Christmas lights. But even with all of the Christmas lights and the blinds that I have set up, I can still only interact with those things at certain times of day, because that's the only time when the light is when the confluence of light comes together. It's like in Hercules when all the planets align. It's that, but I have to do that every time I want to read or write or play one of those video games. Now it's what happens if you don't? If you write outside of one of those times? Basically, it feels really bad. Which is probably obvious. And I then associate that feeling with the thing that I was reading for the rest of time. Or writing, usually. Writing is where it comes into play the most, because if I associate a writing project with a type of lighting that is bad, then I will be unable to go forward with it. I will be completely uninspired and I won't have any drive to finish the story. The story is essentially then tainted inside of my brain. It's the emotional equivalent of when you eat a food and then you puke that food up and then you can never eat it again. That's the way that it feels inside my brain. It's something that I just can't cross. So basically what this means is that there are very particular times of day and lighting conditions and places that I can be when I am reading, because otherwise the story that I'm reading will become tainted. And then I won't be able to, physically, I suppose I could continue to read it, but it feels wrong and bad, and I wouldn't be able to enjoy it anymore. If I'm not enjoying what I'm reading, I don't understand what the point is to be reading it, considering that it's one of my hobbies. It also tends to be a lot harder for me to focus when the light is bad. So even on a much more basic level, it's a lot harder for me to keep my attention on the thing that I am engaging with when the light is not the way that I think that it should be. Consequently, the amount of reading time that I have available to me is less than would be ideal. Obviously, everybody has things that prevent them from reading, but usually those things are like appointments, or they have other things going on in their lives, like being a parent, having a job, so on and so forth. But I, in particular, have the problem of having large swaths of the day where I can't read even if I am free to do so. Additionally, if I am on a train or a plane or traveling somewhere, if I'm not at home, typically I cannot be counted on to be able to read. There are times when I can find a cafe or a nice restaurant with ambience that I like where I can read, but I can't count on it, because if I'm not in a place where I'm in complete control of the lighting quality, chances are it's not going to fit right for my brain for me to be able to do those things. So if I happen to be on vacation or if I am traveling somewhere, for the most part, I can't really read during those times. Now, I will say there is a little bit of flexibility with this, in that I can read things that it's difficult because the quality that I would describe is not one that I can put into words, and also probably one that doesn't make sense. Side note, yesterday I learned that weeds are not actually a taxonomic definition of a particular type of plant. They're actually just a plant that's growing somewhere where it shouldn't be growing, which I thought was interesting. And that kind of feels like the same as this, because there's no exact description of a book that I can read outside of the very particular parameters that I've described. But typically they're going to be outside of the usual genres that I would read. I have spoken at length about how the main thing that I read is fantasy. So fantasy and science fiction tend to almost always fall within the category category of I need to have the very particular parameters in order to read them. However, I can read things that are not those things in other circumstances. So, for example, recently I read One of Us is Lying, which is a YA murder mystery, and I was able to read that outside of the things that I've laid out as like the needs for the reading. Typically, these things have to kind of meet in the middle. So I can't have like the worst lighting and still be able to read something like that. I would be able to read like a car manual or something, you know, I don't become illiterate during those times, but I do become unable to engage with stories in any meaningful way. So the worse the lighting is for me, the more unable I am to engage with stories. It happens on like a spectrum. So if the lighting is, you know, okay, then I could usually swing something like a thriller or something like that. But fantasy is still my favorite. That's still the main thing that I want to be reading. It's the thing that makes me the happiest. So I pretty much end up focusing on that and only reading during the times of day when I know that I can. I recognize that this was very confusing, probably, but I hope it made sense in some kind of way. It is pretty nerve-wracking to put my very particular brain quirks onto the internet, but I hope some of you somehow related a little bit. Either way, tell me about the way in which your brain doesn't work down below. I am happy to answer questions about this particular weird brain thing that I have going on, and otherwise, I hope you guys are keeping a good, happy, healthy, normal-ish, what even is that, brain situation, and most importantly, have a beautiful night, universe.